Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's Connected Conversation, a program conducted by the Idaho Humanities Council. If you're not familiar with our organization, I encourage you to check out our website, idahohumanities.org. I would like to remind you all that you may submit any questions using the Q&A feature located at the bottom of the screen. With me tonight is Salome Mwangi, and she serves as the Refugee Speakers Bureau Coordinator at the Idaho Office for Refugees. It's an honor to have you with us tonight, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Doug. It's such a privilege and an honor to be sharing some of my experiences as somebody who came here as a refugee and also working within the refugee community and coordinating the Refugee Speakers Bureau, which is part of the Idaho Office for Refugees. Excuse me. So the genesis of the refugee resettlement program here in the United States started with the Displaced Persons Act of 1948 in the wake of the end of the World War II. And then in 1975, there was the resettlement of Indo-Chinese refugees through an ad hoc refugee task force, which had temporary funding at the time. And then the 1980 Refugee Act, which was passed by Congress, and what that did is that it aligned itself with the UN, the United Nations definition for refugee. And I just thought we'd take a few steps back into what that looked like in Idaho, because this is the general US picture. The genesis of the program in Idaho started in 1975. The then governor, John Evans, was able to resettle people, to allow people to come to the States through the Indo-Chinese refugee resettlement program. And at that time, the people who were being resettled were the refugees from Vietnam, from Laos, from Cambodia, and other Southeast Asia countries. You can tell I'm a little nervous, but I'm going to settle down. And then after that, there was refugee groups fleeing the oppressive Soviet-era regime from Eastern Europe. And after that, then there was the other refugee groups that came, that sought resettlement and ended up here. So I thought we would take a look and find out, so who is a refugee? How do you get assigned that title of refugee? So refugees are people who have fled their country and are unwilling or unable to return back to their homeland because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution based on one of the following: based on their race, their nationality, their religion, their political opinion, or their social group. In my opinion, I've found that, and really practically on the ground, that it really usually isn't just one thing. It could be your religion and your political opinion, or your nationality and the national group that you belong to. So any one of these five, as long as you are fleeing your country because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution, then that qualifies you to be a refugee. Now, in order for you to be a refugee, you do have to cross an international border. So you flee from your country and usually people go to the neighboring country. The human being is an amazing person because we are the eternal optimists, hoping that the situation will die down and that we will be able to go back to our countries of origin. Now, I'm well acquainted with this because my own story started with getting married to a man who had fled his country, Ethiopia. We met in Kenya, which is my country of origin. And even when he fled, he was hoping that one day he would be able to go back. And so he had actually come over as a visitor. And every 6 months he would renew his visa to remain in Kenya as a visitor in the hope that one day he would be able to go back to Ethiopia. But that was never to happen. And so we ended up getting married and starting a family. And I was really amazed at this world that refugees operate in that I was completely oblivious to, even though we were neighbors with Ethiopia, and yet I had no clue the atrocities that were going on in that country, and how difficult they made it for some of the people to the point to where they had to flee. So my ex-husband actually fled because of his political opinion and because of the social group that he belonged to. He belonged to a tribe called the Oromo, which is the biggest tribe in Ethiopia that has been agitating for its own independence. But rather than being independent, there has been a lot of civil and political oppression to the Oromo group. So again, doing a big picture, taking a bigger picture look at displaced people, because really displaced people, you know, there's people who run away from where they are because of, and a very good example here in the US is Katrina, when people had to flee from Louisiana because they could no longer stay there, but that was because of an environmental dilemma. So currently about 71 people have been forcefully displaced worldwide. Of those, 41 million, about 41 million are internally displaced people. So that means that you're within your own country, you're within your own region, but you have had to move from the place that you call home into a better place, maybe because of the fires, for example, like the fires we're currently experiencing, or some other disaster that has forced you to leave your home. Then we have about 26 million refugees worldwide and 3.5 million people who are seeking asylum. I know people will ask the difference between, what's the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker? And I normally say it's kind of like the difference between seeking permission or asking for forgiveness. So a refugee is somebody who gets permission to gain entry into the third country of resettlement before they get there. So all your paperwork, all your background information, all that is done before you get into the country. And an asylum seeker is somebody who, unlike a refugee, is able to gain access into the country. You could be here as a student, you could be here on training, you could be coming here to visit and you've been granted a visa that lets you stay here for a short time. However, you're unable to go back into your country because of the well-founded fear. And so people end up staying and seeking asylum. So like I said, it's either seeking permission or seeking forgiveness. Of the groups that, of the refugees, of the people who run away as refugees, there's three options that are available to them. There's repatriation, and in repatriation means that the situation comes down in your country of origin and you're able to go home. So if it is fighting that has been going on, the warring groups or whatever, come to a truce or come to an agreement and the people are able to go back. There's local integration, and this is the next best option, such that instead of having to go back to your country when there's still fighting going on, being allowed to remain in the country where you have sought refuge, your first country that you have sought refuge. But you'll find that many countries are unwilling to accommodate refugees and allow them to integrate locally. And that is what happened to my ex-husband, to where he wanted to remain in Kenya legally, but there was no legal means for him to do that. And they would tell him there's only two options. It's either go back to your country of origin, Ethiopia, or seek resettlement into a third country. And that is where many refugees end up. However, of all this, of the 26.5 million refugees, when the system was working the way it was supposed to work, before we have had all the challenges that we have experienced along the way, only 1% end up being resettled as refugees in a third country. So I just thought I'd give you a little bit of a snapshot into the conditions under which refugees live, especially in the refugee camps. So you can have urban refugees, and those are refugees who have probably somebody from outside the country who is supporting them financially so that they don't have to go and live in a refugee camp. They're able to live in a bigger city where life is a little better. But for majority of the refugees who end up in a refugee camp, this is what a refugee camp looks like. And this is in my country of origin, Kenya. And I was horrified to see this because, like I said, I had no clue that this is what refugees face. This is in the Kasulu camp, which is in Tanzania. And as you can see, when refugees tell you that they lived in a tent, it really is a temporary structure that barely gives you any sense of privacy. This is the Maela camp in Nepal. And then I thought, let's just go through what the resettlement process looks like. Now, remember, this is a process that takes years. For many people, they will have lived in a refugee camp for 10, 15, 20 years. There's very many couples who meet at the refugee camp, get married at the refugee camp, start their families at the refugee camp. And the process starts with fleeing home. So you run away from home because your family is under attack, your tribe is under attack, and so you have to flee in order to save your life. That is usually a very harrowing journey, and a journey of loss, and a journey that is filled with trauma. And then you get to the point where you're able to make it. So for example, let's say you're from the Congo. So you've run away from the Congo and you've managed to get into Burundi, or you've managed to get into Rwanda, or you've managed to get into Tanzania. And all these are countries that actually border the Congo. So you've just run away from your country and into the next country. Once you get there, you're able to seek the protection of the UNHCR. So that's the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. And when you get there, you're registered as a refugee. They listen to your story. They actually take down your information. And so while you're there, even though we say that you do have you're seeking the protection, those are still horror-filled camps that refugees end up in. The story of my ex-husband is that because he was an urban refugee and we ended up getting married, he did not have to go and live in a refugee camp, but he did go to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees and register as a refugee. So he had that paperwork, but that paperwork that had his picture in it, had his name, his date of birth, had his basic information, did not accord him any protection. The police from my country would still go and seek out refugees and get them imprisoned and sometimes extort bribes from them. And the process of being deported was a long and drawn out process, and you would end up in a jail. And I can assure you that a Kenyan jail is the last place anybody needs to be. During the time that we were together, because of, and like I said, I was so ignorant to what was really going on. He was a person who was extremely nervous, did not want to go out on most days because he knew that if he met with the police, then there was always the possibility that he would be harassed, he would be asked to give money, and all he was trying to do was stay alive, really. So the beauty of being able to go to the UNHCR laden with fear and not always getting the protection that you're looking for is that you have access to a third country resettlement program. The US has historically been one of the countries that takes the most refugees into the country. There's also Canada, there's Australia, there's Belgium. And once you apply, so you'll be asked, like, do you have any preference for the country that you're applying to? So some people will have relatives in Australia and they'll say, if I can, I'd like to go to Australia, or if I can, I'd like to go to the US. So depending on your circumstances, and if you have friends and relatives who can help you in the initial resettlement process, then that is usually a priority. If you don't, then they will just apply, the UNHCR will apply to whichever country is willing to resettle you. Then the screening process starts. And it's a multi-layer process where you have the security screening, they listen to your story, they do some digging and find out, is what you're saying true? Is your country actually at war? Is your group, is your social group actually being persecuted? Then there's also a medical screening that you go through. And all these screenings that happen normally have expiration dates, and you'll find the only way you can be able to travel once you are approved is making sure that your security screening that you went through is still valid, and your medical screening that you went through is still valid. And if one or the other fails, then you kind of go back to the bottom of the line, and then you start all over again. Fortunately, because of the situation that my ex-husband was facing, and the fact that they had security forces from Ethiopia in Nairobi looking for some of those people who had managed to get away, they were able to process. Now, our process was expedited, and it still took 2 years. So you can imagine how much longer it takes for the other people. And we were able to get to a point where the security and the medical screenings that had come back that had come back as clear were in tandem with each other. And after that, we were approved for resettlement into a third country. In our case, it was in the US. And so 2 years from when we started, we were able to travel and get resettled in the US. Now, when we came into the US, we were initially taken to New Hampshire. And I like cracking this joke that the people in New Hampshire were as cold as the weather. They really were a cold lot. It was very difficult to get anything done. And it's probably not the people within the community, but the agency that received us was not very efficient or organized. I'm not sure what happened. And I knew within 3 weeks that that is not a place that I wanted to be for the long haul. My daughter at the time was 8 months old. I remember she got sick, and I had no clue what to do, where to go to, didn't know who to even ask a question about where do I get treatment for my daughter. I had a sister who at the time was a student at Boise State University, and she's the one who told me, it's not supposed to be that challenging, and especially when you have a child and you need a little more support. So with her encouragement, we were able to find our way from New Hampshire to Boise, and coming to Boise compared to what we had gone through in New Hampshire was like night and day. I couldn't believe it when we got here. There were people from the agency at the airport who received us. They put us up with a host family who were able to stay with us. We were able to stay with them for about, I believe it was about 10 or 15 days while they prepared an apartment for us. And then we finally moved into our own place, and it was such a relief to be able to do that. Now, the resettlement process is one that has so many fingers in this pie, and it's a good thing that we have so many people who have their fingers in this pie. Like I had mentioned before, we have the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. We have Congress, we have the US President, we have the US Department of State. So when the background checks are being done and the security checks are being done, they're actually done at that high level of the Department of State. Then when we get here, there's the Health and Human Services who make sure that we get Medicaid, that we get food stamps, that we get the supports that we need to get us off the ground. Then you also have the national and local resettlement agencies. And those are the ones who receive you, and they assign you a case manager. And that's the case manager who makes sure that you're ramped up and you're off, and that you're taking off at a good speed in a good time. Because the resettlement process here in the US is one of the most rigorous. And I really appreciated it because it helps you get on your feet as soon as you can. Obviously with some supports along the way. The longest that you receive support from the resettlement agency financially is a maximum of 8 months. And a lot of the finances that are given, it's not direct cash to you. It is the rent that is being paid and the utilities. And then there's a small allowance of, I think it was something as little as $30. And that's supposed to help you buy a laundry soap and get your laundry done. There's also the state and local governments that obviously come in. The nonprofits and the faith-based organizations are phenomenal, especially here in Idaho. And then you also have individual donors and volunteers. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate to this day the donors and the volunteers who came to our aid. You would find that I remember initially somebody gave us a crib, but we didn't have a mattress for my daughter, who by that time was about 9 months old. And I'm trying to think, my goodness, where do I even find a mattress? And even if I find a mattress, how do I pay for it? And it is this volunteers who would come and say, you know what, I noticed that you don't have this, let me get it for you. I noticed that you have pots, but you don't have plates, or whatever it is that is needed. They came around, and sometimes it wasn't just the tangible stuff like I'm mentioning. Sometimes it was intangible things like a ride to a doctor's visit, or a ride to church or to the mosque, or whatever else, or whatever other support that you needed from the community. That is what the volunteers were able to do. And to this day, some of them are very good friends. And I especially appreciate the fact that it seemed, even when somebody had to move, maybe they had to move because of work or had to move because family was moving, they would actually hand you off to somebody else who would continue. And if it were not for them, I would not be sitting here today being able to articulate the process and the journey that this has taken. So on this long road home to Idaho, I love this map and the whole terminology of Idaho and Idaho becoming home. Locally, at this time, we have 3 agencies that welcome refugees and help them figure their way out around this new place. There's the International Rescue Committee, or the IRC. And then there's the Agency for New Americans. Both of those are agencies here in Boise. And then we also do have resettlement going on in Twin Falls under the College of Southern Idaho Refugee Agency. So refugees in Idaho can either be resettled in Boise or they can be resettled in Twin Falls. Both are amazing places to raise families. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have come here. When I came here in 2004, when we were resettled here, there was another agency called World Relief, which has since shut its doors as the numbers of refugees being resettled dwindled. Now they're the ones who came, met us at the airport, helped to find an apartment, to furnish it, to. Now people think that refugees receive a lot of money that when they get here. They don't, because the funding that they receive is actually the one that buys the bed and buys the furniture and any other needs that you have. It comes from that pot of money. So again, nobody's giving you the money and saying, go find yourself a bed. It's the agency that does that. Donations from the community go a long way in making sure that when you get here, you are supported. So we were really surprised when we came here to find a host family that they had said we could stay with them for as long as we needed. And that was the first inkling to me about what a welcoming community Idaho truly is. Obviously, we were jet lagged, time differences, because I think Kenya right now is about 10 hours ahead of us. So you can imagine, and I feel like it's harder traveling back into time than traveling towards time. Your brain knows about tomorrow, but doesn't know how to go into yesterday. So we really struggled with that. And the family would tell us, it's okay, you do what you gotta do to take care of yourself, and really allowed us to process the process that we had just come through. The agency was also able to provide the volunteers. A lot of the volunteers that we worked with actually came through the agency that we were working with at the time. And so we were able to get rides into the medical side, and there's the immunization program that everybody goes through. We had no clue what was going on. And then you come here. Anyway, so I truly appreciate the agencies and the support that they give refugees once they come here. because then it is a less scary journey. And even in the occasion that you do not speak English. Now, I came here speaking English, but I spoke British English. And so it still took me time to ramp up my English into American English and to understand exactly what was being said. And even for people to understand me, a lot of times, I remember once I needed to use the restroom and I didn't know that it's called the restroom because we didn't call it the restroom, we called it the loo. So I was looking for the loo and nobody had an idea what I was looking for. Finally, however, one gentleman who had lived in the UK said, Salome, I think you're looking for what we call a bathroom or a restroom. And they were able to help me out. So the volunteers who worked with us went a long way in helping us decipher life and figure it out. And even when you speak English. Now, for those who do not speak English, volunteers are a great way to begin speaking the language, because if you're with them and you don't speak any other language, you have to pick up English as a language, whether you like it or not. We normally come here with our children. Our children, it's so much easier for them to become socialized because they go to school or they go to daycare. And before you know it, your kids are coming home. For me, my daughter started coming home with a vocabulary I'd never heard of. She would say, oh, you know, Mom, Joseph had cooties. And so I'd be on the phone with the daycare finding out what are cooties and should I be scared of them? Or when she would come home and decide, oh, Mom, I want mac and cheese. And actually, she didn't even call them mac and cheese. At the time, she was really tiny. She called them cronima cheese. And so I was, again, on the phone with the daycare trying to find out what is cronima cheese. And they would tell me what they are. And I had no clue. I had not grown up with mac and cheese. And so, again, that was that getting integrated into the community and making sure that I understand what it is my daughter needs in order to be able to meet those needs as any good parent should. So once we get here, once we have our ducks in a row, so to speak, one of the needs that we have is to be able to sustain ourselves. The US resettlement program is all about becoming self-sufficient. And you hear that message from the first day that you get here until you actually are on your own and your case manager is telling you goodbye, I've taken care of you, you guys are able to take care of yourselves. We're still here for the next 5 years until you become a citizen. However, we feel like you've come a long way. Now imagine being able to do that in 8 months, coming to a new country, most likely without the language, with children, setting them up in school, you finding a job and figuring out your way to work and back home. It really is a crazy situation. However, it is doable. Many people have done it over the years. And I think more than just people being able to do that, being able to get to work and get their kids to school and figuring life out, is the fact that once we get here, we're able to bring our flavors here. And it's not just flavors when it comes to food, it's flavors when it comes to the food that we grow. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Global Gardens, which is a project of Idaho Office for Refugees, where former refugees are given pieces of land where they grow food. It could be vegetables or fruit that are consumed here within the community. So some of them they're able to consume themselves. I love being able to buy mchicha or other greens that I grew up with that former refugees are able to grow. Or it could be a restaurant. This is food from one of the refugee-owned restaurants here. It's Ethiopian food. Or it could be, I don't know how many of you love the very bitter Middle Eastern coffee or the Middle Eastern cuisine. It's right there. Or it could be other people who have been able to set up their own shops and can make African clothes or things out of the African fabric. And for me, this is just an amazing show of how resilient the human spirit is and how when we work together, then we truly are able to achieve this dream of integration to where I don't have to give up myself in order to fit in this community. And even for you who belongs to this community, we are still able to work together and to get life done. And while we're doing that, we're actually adding flavor. So I'm learning about the mac and cheese. You're learning about the bitter greens that are from my community and why do we like them and what's the best way to make them in order to enrich both your lives and mine. There's very many people who see the African women who we tend to dress rather colorfully compared to how other people here dress. And so trying to figure out, okay, so if I want to dress like that, where can I get it? Or if I want a bag, if I want to honor the community that you have come from and what you're doing, how can you do that? And so one of the things that I am very proud of is the social integration program that we have at the Idaho Office for Refugees, where we're able to talk about the expectation of this community that you're coming into, so that as you're stepping into it, you're not getting caught on the wrong foot because, oh, I didn't know that I couldn't do that with my kids, or I didn't realize that I couldn't leave my kids on their own while I run to the store, because apparently here there's different rules, and it's true, there are different rules. So in the social integration, we go into the places where people who came here as refugees or as immigrants are made aware of what are the traffic laws. If it says 35, can you go 36? And what happens when you're given a ticket? How do you navigate that? Or, I gave the example of how do you handle your kids now that everybody lives in their own home? And yes, it does take a village, but in this village, everybody has their own address where they live. So this is the end goal of resettlement, that you would be able to get integrated and that you would be able to give some of your flavor and give some of the strengths that you come with. Each culture, each community has its challenges and has its strong points. So how do we navigate those challenges that we're finding in this community? And a lot of this work is not done. I'm not the one who does it. In fact, it really does take this community, this village. We have people from the city of Boise. We have people from the Boise Police Department. We have people from the Idaho Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. We have people who work with, who are experts at mental health. And so we're able to talk about these things in a way that is non-threatening and before they become a problem. So I have breezed through this and I have come to the part where you can ask questions. But maybe before you ask the question, I'm sure some of you are wondering, okay, so what happened to your husband? You're calling him an ex-husband. Yes, he is an ex-husband. Unfortunately, even though we survived the journey of resettlement and we made it here into the US, our relationship was not strong enough to weather the integration part of it. And so he moved to a different place. I was left here with our daughter. My daughter is now 16 years old. And she has become the one who teaches me about, no, Mom, that's not how things are done here. She participates in sports. She's played soccer, she's played basketball. And I have learned in the country that I came from, I would have sent her out to play. And when she's done, she would come home when she was, spent in energy. And now I've realized, wait a minute, that's not how parenting is done here. I have to attend those basketball games. I've had to figure out where is Notice and where is Palmer and just show up, and for my daughter to realize, oh, because the other parents are doing that. So that is how my own story went. I became a citizen, I cannot believe it, about 10 years ago. And so it's been an amazing journey of learning, of opening myself up, of allowing other people to come into my otherwise private world, to realize that refugees are people just like you and I, who unfortunately have had to leave their countries and cannot go back because of one of the 5 reasons that I gave you. And that of the ones that we see here, those are part of the 1%. Can you believe it? Just 1% of the about 26 million. So out of 26 million, just 260,000. And those are not the ones who actually come to the US. Those are the ones who are resettled in any country. And so the US takes a fraction of that. And I am very grateful that we were able to find our way here. And so I'll open it up to any questions or comments that you may have.
Well, I just want to say thank you for that wonderful presentation and all that information. Definitely it was an eye-opening uh, presentation, I think, for a lot of people. One of the questions I did have to open this up is you showed the different photos of the refugee camps, and I know some people like to refer to them as informal settlements rather than refugee camps and stuff like that. Now, is the treatment of those settlements and those refugee camps kind of standard in a lot of different countries that act as that like middle country between the start of the refugee process and the resettlement process? And like, what is that treatment typically?
So the beauty of it is that you do have the UNHCR on the ground, along with the UNHCR, because they really cannot meet all the needs of the refugees. Their resources are limited. And so what I've found is that a lot of in the other countries, they actually call non-governmental organizations, so the non-profits. So you'll find Care International or the World Food Program or Compassion International. So all of them, you'll find the Doctors Without Borders. You'll find many of them working in those refugee camps to try and bridge the gap between what the UNHCR is offering and what the needs are. They try and make it as humane as possible. But like I said, you'll find that there's almost like bad blood from the local communities who live there. And they wonder, so why are all these people who are coming from different countries receiving in our own country services that we do not have? Like they have medical services and maybe the local communities does not have medical services. But what I've found is that a lot of those NGOs who work in the refugee camps try and take care of the refugees, and they also try and take care of the local communities so that we don't have this animosity going on between the refugees who are obviously fleeing their own country and have nowhere else to go to, and the local communities where they have been placed. However, you'll find that a lot of times the refugee camps are in extremely remote places, like the refugee camp in Kenya, the one that I just showed you, is on the border of Kenya and Sudan. So if you were to take a bus or public transportation, it would probably take you 3 days of travel just to be able to get there. And that's part of that distance that they try to put between the local community and the refugee community.
And then what are some of the biggest surprises you personally had when you arrived in Idaho?
Actually, in the US, it felt like everybody drove on the wrong side of the road. I grew up driving on the left, or, everybody kept left. And then I came to the US and it was keep right. And so that was such a huge shock. It felt like we're going to crash at any time now because everybody's on the wrong side. But obviously, after a while, it becomes your new normal. The food was also really, really surprising. I thought the food out here would be tasty. I was amazed at how bland it is. And I think part of it is that a lot of us came from communities where food grew. We haven't interfered too much with food. So you have food growing in its season. And obviously when you're eating it in its season, it's when it's tastiest. So whether it's mangoes or oranges or apples or strawberries, we could only consume them when they were in season. And so you were getting the best nutrition and the best flavor for that food. And so it took me a long time to finally figure out how to cook food and give it the flavor that I was used to.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. Since I moved from DC out to Idaho, there's definitely a lack in some flavors in Boise regarding food. And then what was the citizenship process like for you? And then do refugees also feel secure in their status before they obtain the citizenship status?
So the citizenship process is relatively straightforward. And I say relatively straightforward because and obviously this is information that I've gathered over time. The information that you submit when you're being admitted as a refugee is the information that they keep checking. So for example, when you come here after 1 year, you're eligible to apply for your green card, your permanent residency, right? So the information that they look for is the same information that was set up when you were applying in your approval process. So you can imagine if my name was misspelled and I didn't notice, because sometimes it is possible not to notice that your name has been misspelled, or they switch the names. That's a very common thing, to where somebody's first name becomes their last name and the last name becomes the first. And then I come here and I'm applying for my green card. Now, if I try to say, no, this is the correct order of my names, wrong answer, it has to go back. So little things like those that you think, hey, you guys are going to correct it. That's not how it goes. So after 1 year, you can apply for your green card. And if you don't have anything, again, they do background checks on you. They fingerprint you and make sure that you're kosher, you're okay. And then after that, 4 years after you receive your green card, you're eligible to apply for your citizenship. And again, it's the same thing. There's a background check that is being made. If you have not tangled with the law, you're fine. It is when people get in trouble with the law and get misdemeanors or felonies on their records that life becomes a little bit more challenging when it comes to getting a green card or getting your citizenship. Now, for me, I didn't have any issue. I've only had one speeding ticket, and that did not affect, it was a citation I paid. It affected my insurance. And that is now part of the reason why we're doing the social integration series, is to help people realize if you're caught if you get a speeding ticket, it affects your insurance. What can you do to take care of things like that so that your life doesn't become miserable because it's becoming too expensive? But other than that, it was pretty straightforward. The agencies here, the resettlement agencies, the IRC or the Agency for New Americans, have somebody who's trained to do those applications. And the best part is that they're able to look at the information that you came in with and make sure that everything is following. And then if there's any hiccup, if there's any delay, they are able to call and figure out what could the delay be. Is it more information that is needed? Is it something that you filled in that you didn't fill in the correct way? Yeah.
And then what changes would you like to see in the refugee process within the United States, given your own experiences?
Like I said, it's a really fast program because you're supposed to be self-sufficient in 8 months.
Mm-hmm.
And you find that in those 8 months, most people will lose their Medicaid. Most people will lose their food stamps because now you're working. So you find a lot of those supports that you had go away. Most people no longer receive rental assistance because you're now working. So especially in Idaho, it would really be great if there's more education, and that education really has to come from the community. I have been a case manager, and I know how overwhelming it was to try, and even just hitting the basics was overwhelming. However, from my own experience of having volunteers who came alongside me, who would come home and read letters. Yes, I read in English, but there's some letters of which I had no clue what the implication is if I do not respond to it. For example, being summoned for jury duty. I was always being called for jury duty before I became a citizen. I've only been summoned once since I became a citizen. But then I'd look at that and I think, well, I'm not a citizen, so I'm not going to bother with it. And yet, no. So it took somebody who understood and who would say, no, yes, you cannot serve on the jury. However, you need to send them a copy of your green card or a copy that shows them this is the reason why I cannot serve. So having people who have run alongside me, so not the case managers, because I really understand how short-staffed they are, but people from the community helping you figure life out. And for those of us who had volunteers helping us, life has become so much easier. And because what they also do is that they connect you, rather than waiting until a situation is really dire, they're able to connect you to whatever resources there within the community to help you out rather than waiting until it's too late. Now, there's somebody who had asked, there was a question about, do refugees feel secure before they become citizens? That can be really tricky because if anything happens to you and you're not a citizen, there's always the danger of you being deported. So, yeah. Now, before I became a citizen, I don't remember feeling that way, but I think in the atmosphere that we have right now, deportation has become a real threat, and we are seeing about it, we're reading about it in the papers, people are experiencing it. So I do believe that refugees and those who have not yet become citizens do have that additional layer of stress that something could go wrong.
And then building off of that, do you know on average how many refugees within the US become citizens, or at least pursue that process of maintaining or obtaining a US citizenship?
I know it's majority of them who do that, because the other thing that happens is that if you do not become a US citizen, the system actually gives you 7 years to become a US citizen. If you're not a US citizen in those 7 years, you cannot receive public assistance. So any public assistance that you have may be receiving, maybe you're somebody who came here with injuries that were so bad you cannot work. So you're probably receiving disability, which is a minimal amount, but you're receiving disability. If you're not a citizen in 7 years, you lose out on your disability payment. That could also put any food stamps or any other public assistance that you're receiving at jeopardy.
And then what kind of jobs are available for refugees within the 8-month deadline from when you first become established in the US to that cutoff point of benefits?
So the beauty of it is that it's really up to you and how much English you're able to pick up. Because one of the things that, especially for people who have what we call limited English proficiency, there's English classes that you can attend. And obviously we are hoping that as you attend these classes and you start practicing, you become better at speaking the language and communicating in the language. But you'll find some people just can't. They've been through so much trauma that it's difficult for them to retain the new words of the new language that you're learning. Then that could also impede or limit the number of jobs that you can find. There's a lot of people who work in the hospitals. There's a lot of people who are caregivers. There's a lot of people who end up doing janitorial jobs. There's the beef factory somewhere out in Kuna that has really done a fantastic job at bringing refugees in and working with them. And I think the other thing that people don't realize is that even though I may not speak English, there could be somebody in the group who speaks English. So that person becomes an interpreter. And even though you're not able to communicate with them directly, there's still another way of communicating.
Yeah, that method is still there to communicate.
Yes.
And then what traits did your family possess that you were able to be set up with for the about 2-week period, I believe you said, that helped you become one of that 1% that became formally resettled?
I'm not sure that there was, I think my ex-husband's story, when they were able to check it out, it checked out. The fact that he was able to express that he felt like his life was in danger, even though he had run away, they were able to verify that. And then thirdly, what had happened was that he spoke Oromo. So he occasionally would interpret or translate things between English and Oromo. And so he actually got to work with the wife of the director of IOM. So IOM is the International Organization for Migration. And the executive director of the IOM at the time, I don't know if that's the same thing today, was at the same level with the US Embassy in Kenya. So he was able to do a direct referral. It's very, very rare, but it happens. And so he was able to say, I know this man, I can stand for him, I believe his story. I'm handing you over to the US Embassy and asking them to do all the background check and everything. And once they accept you, then you can go on the fast track. I mean, they didn't even say that it would be a fast track. It's just that that's how it turned out to be. So because of that connection that he already had with the IOM executive director, we were able to come here a lot quicker than other people would.
And I know you mentioned for your fast track, it was about a 2-year process from Kenya to the US.
Mhm.
So how long is like the normal process about?
About, I think the minimum I've heard is 5 years. So as somebody who's been in a refugee camp, or from the moment they entered the refugee camp to getting to the US, 5 years, people are, oh my goodness, it took you such a short time. And there's others who've been in refugee camps for 20 years.
Yeah.
20 years.
With your ex-husband, I know you mentioned how his group was being persecuted in his home country, and there were the people in Kenya like looking for refugees of his group.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you balance that while also going through the long process of resettlement? Like, do you have any safeguards put in place once you start that process to protect you?
You don't. So it's almost like you're playing cat and mouse, a game of cat and mouse, to where I remember it got to a point where he would not leave the house unless it was absolutely necessary. So he was a person who really loved going to church. And there were times he would just say, I'm not going to take that risk of going to church. Or if I'm going to go to a place where I feel like I'm taking an unnecessary risk, I have to have somebody who's going to give me a ride. So that really affects everybody, because then you're not able to go with him places, even though you'd like to go together, because he feels like he would be placing his life at risk
Yeah.
to do that.
And earlier when you were talking about the um, Idaho refugee department, what you mentioned the police role, and I was wondering if you could expand more on what the police role in working with the Idaho Office for Refugees is in regards to integrating the refugees into the community.
So the beauty, and this is something that's really unique here in Boise, is that they have a refugee liaison officer. So this is a police officer who's been trained on how to work with the refugees and how to work through the languages and the cultures that sometimes hinder communication. And what we know here within the refugee community is that if you have an issue, instead of trying to find a way to call 343 cops or whatever, you can call Jessica. Her name is Officer Jessica Nar. So you can get in touch with her. And so she makes sure that whoever is investigating, I mean, obviously, unless it's an emergency, if it's an emergency, you dial 911, but the police officers responding to such a case will still call interpreters either on the phone or to show up there. So with Jessica, Officer Jessica, we've been able to come up with those, she's able to see what are the crimes that keep being reported, what are some of the challenges that the community is suffering from. And rather than going down the legal route of law enforcement and then the legal system, the court system, which obviously messes up what can we do to mitigate that? What can if it is something that is, for example, domestic violence, where some of the cultures that we come from, hey, if the husband is not happy with the wife, he slaps her around and that's it, right? Well, that's not going to fly here in the US.
Yeah.
So how can we educate these couples who are coming in here on how to find alternative ways of dealing with some of the challenges that they face? And it's the same thing with dealing with children, because you'll find some of our kids come here and they're like, hey, I speak English. I'm able to understand what is being said. I can con mom, or I can actually put mom in trouble, because I can call and say, mom is slapping me. And by the time they get to the fact and realize, wait a minute, this is just a kid being a teenager, a lot of damage has been done. So that's part of what Officer Nar does with the refugee community. She's a great resource to where you can go to her and whatever it is. So you're able to talk without beating around the bush, which is what some of our cultures do. We talk while beating around the bush. You're able to just tell her, hey, this is what I'm struggling with, or this is what the challenge is. How can we deal with this before it's spinning out of control? Yeah.
And then do you have any suggestions on how the average citizen can better support refugees in our community? And the person asking states that they don't have a whole lot of time or ability to participate in a formal organization, but they still want to contribute in some form. So any options geared towards that direction?
So, like I said, the IRC, Agency for New Americans, CSI refugee program could always benefit from more hands or more money because the funding that they receive is federal funds, and federal funds come with limits as to what you can do. Being able to support them in the community. Sometimes, believe it or not, I still have people who will send me a picture of a letter that they received in the mail, and they tell me, could you please read it to me and tell me what it is that I need to do? Sometimes it is just that once a week, 30 minutes reading through mail, and that is it. You could also help other organizations that support refugees. We have Tidwell Social Work Services. They do mental health. There's a lot of refugees, like I said, who come here and after a while they lose their Medicaid and they're not able to continue receiving the support of their mental health counselor. I know an organization called Global, so G and then local, and they do a lot of work within the refugees that is outside the scope of the agencies. Sometimes they'll move furniture, sometimes they'll set up apartments for somebody who's moving. Sometimes they'll have something like a baby shower for a woman who's come here as a refugee and has a baby and needs a crib or needs diapers or needs whatever it is. They're able to help them get connected to those places.
And earlier in your presentation, you mentioned how there's a lot of refugee groups in Boise and that College of Southern Idaho is a more recent addition for Twin Falls. Do you know of any plans for more of a Northern Idaho branch, I guess, for refugees? Or is it more just focused in the southern part of the state?
For now, I think it's just focused on the southern side of the state. And I actually happened to take a short vacation and I went up north because I've never been up north. And I'm not sure that that is the right place to take them at this time. There's a lot of work that would need to happen within the community in order for the refugees when they go there to feel like they're in a place where they're welcome and that they can call home. Right now, the atmosphere doesn't feel that way. When we were there, it was very obvious that we were sticking out like sore thumbs. And I'd gone there with my sister, obviously another person of color, her two kids and myself. And even her husband, who is white, happened to say he had never experienced what he experienced now that he traveled with us. And just the sense of being on edge wherever we went to. But the funny thing, though, is that when people ask me where I'm from, obviously, when I open my mouth, you can tell I'm not from here. And I said I'm from Kenya, it's like they relax a little bit. So I don't know, maybe there is hope that refugee resettlement can happen there sooner rather than later.
Well, and I'm sure given time that unfortunate feeling will go away and the community will be able to adjust and be welcoming towards refugees, especially when they see all the wonderful things that refugees do have to offer towards communities. So fingers crossed on that.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. My last question to round out tonight's presentation: is the UN High Commission on Refugees easily accessible for a refugee, or is it kind of like you have to jump through a few hoops to be able to access them?
Usually, wherever the refugee camps are, there's always a UNHCR office.
Okay.
So they always have people there. And from what I've heard, because I never ended up in a refugee camp, they tend to staff it with the locals to kind of like keep it, on an even ground so that you don't have, for example, somebody running away from Ethiopia into Kenya and then finding his own people working there. And the very people that he was running away from are the very people who are now deciding how his case is going to be presented. Yeah, but in fact, I wanted to add something a little bit because, somebody asked about what are some of the surprises that I found when I came here. And one of it is probably the biggest is individualistic lifestyles where everybody lives by themselves, does everything by themselves, goes to the store by themselves, goes to watch a movie by themselves. And many of us come from collectivist cultures to where I don't go to the market by myself. I go with my community, and I don't cook dinner by myself. I cook with my community, and I don't eat by myself. So that is another huge thing. And sometimes you'll find when we first move here, we really struggle with that, with the fact that we don't seem to have the community that we were used to in our everyday living.
Yeah, I definitely also feel that way because I'm just a very social person.
Uh-huh.
So with COVID and the quarantine, that aspect of my life's been completely shut down.
Right.
So I definitely understand that feeling of that shift overall into that more individualized approach.
Yeah. And then, if anybody wants my email address, I'm okay with you sharing my email address.
Yeah, I will put it up on our website right by the recording once the recording gets posted. That way, anyone can reach out to you with any
Yeah.
further questions or ways to help. And unfortunately, we are out of time tonight, but I did want to say thank you again for joining us tonight, everyone. And thank you again, Salome, for giving us all the wonderful information.
Thank you, Doug. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, everybody.
Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.